Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm János Pastor, Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, or C2G. And I am speaking today with Ms. Rola Dashti, the Executive Secretary of the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, also known as ESCWA. ESCWA promotes cooperation among its 20 member states in their efforts to ensure prosperity, equality, and peace. It supports Arab countries with policy recommendations that build on a thorough analysis of regional and national economic, social, and environmental trends in light of the United Nations Global Agenda. Ms. Dashti is a leading Kuwaiti economist and longtime champion of women's rights, gender equality, and democratic reform. Before moving to ESCWA in 2019, Ms. Dashti served as a member of the Supreme Planning Council in Kuwait. From 2012 to 2014, she was Minister for Planning and Development and Minister of State for Parliamentary Affairs. Ms. Dashti played a pivotal role in advocating for a decree to allow Kuwaiti women to vote and run for parliamentary elections, and in May 2009, she, with 3 other women, became the first women to be elected to Kuwait's parliament. Ms. Dashti, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thank you. Thank you, János, very much for having me.
So let's start perhaps by you telling us about your work at ESCWA, and in particular on how your focus on cooperation and sustainable development is supporting countries in the region to tackle climate change. And in doing that, maybe you could also share with us what are the major climate-related challenges facing the Arab region.
Thank you first, János, for the introduction. And let me maybe highlight 4 key challenges. I can summarize them in terms of financing, in terms of increase in mean temperature, the decline in precipitation, and the climate data availability for informed policy decisions. These are, I can say, key challenges. When it comes to financing, János, the Arab states, as you know, are struggling and are heavily debted. And COVID-19 pushed our gross public debt to a record high in the Arab region, reaching $1.4 trillion, putting some of the middle-income countries at high risk of debt vulnerability. Add to it now, today, with the war on Ukraine, we have an additional burden of financing almost around $1 billion for these coming months, and our GDP losses in the region is accounting for around $11 billion, with almost 3 million additional people are drifted to poverty in terms. In addition, talking about financing, the region also receives only 6% of its financing in adaptation, despite our region, as we say, goes into water scarcity region. And the Arab region are also have very low, especially the LDCs, which they receive only 5% of the climate financing that comes to the region, putting them also on a very vulnerable stage. And because of the debt issue and the financing and the burden of it, it's unfortunately also the Arab region receives loan more than grants for climate projects, where loans exceed grants by a level of 10 to 1%. As we go to the temperature, which is extremely important, and I actually come from Kuwait, a very high temperature, and it's a risk of it. And sometimes we reach in the summer the highest temperature we record globally into it. We are very much, the region is very much vulnerable to climate change impacts on temperature, and the region already have seen an increase of 2 Celsius degree into it, and they were anticipating by the end of century of a 5 degrees Celsius, which will be impacting water and food vulnerability, which will be increasing. And as you know, the region is a very water scarce region, with 60% of our population are living in areas that face water scarcity compared to the global average of 35%. And 2/3 of our region's freshwater resources crosses one or more international boundaries, which aggravates also conflicts in the absence of shared water management networks. And this becomes a very important issue, the issue of the transboundary of water and management of water to prevent conflicts in the region that we don't need it. And as we said also, there is an increase also as a result of these challenges. The drought and land degradation are driving food insecurity and the humanitarian crisis further. We have lost almost 63% of our arable land, which are very vulnerable to climate change. And this increases our dependence on imports of food and deplete consequently our foreign reserves when countries are already, as I stated, struggling with heavy debt burdens into it. And now talking about the war in Ukraine, also where a lot of Arab countries import wheat, for example, from Ukraine and Russia. It's making also the food security issues, and wheat is a very stable food item in our dietary nutrition. It becomes making our countries also vulnerable to it. But having countries to look and mitigate for food security in terms of planting and growing wheat in their countries, like in Egypt and other countries and Syria, others, water becomes a very important issue. And the climate impact and on challenges, as I said, on the increasing of temperature, on the precipitation issue, is making it also harder for food security issue into the country. So we're talking about interlinkages for climate is not impacting one, it's a global interlinkages impacting people globally, and this needs to be addressed at a global level and commitment from the global community and all nations.
It's actually fascinating to hear how you describe these interlinkages, including with the current geopolitical crisis. And I was just wondering to what extent you see this as a unifying challenge in the region. I'm sure that these impacts appear differently in the different countries, but still, do you see a kind of unified approach to addressing them? And if so, what is the region planning to do about it?
Yes, climate is unified in certain perspectives of it. As I said, the way we look at it at ESCWA, and we're pushing Arab countries, is that we're looking at it from the interlinkages perspective of food, energy, and water nexus, and addressing that issues and the challenges. And this is where we brought ministers of water and Minister of Water and Agriculture together with the League of Arab States to start discussing it, because, as you know, agriculture is consuming a majority of water in our region, and bringing a solidified mechanism is extremely important to unify it. Plus, as I just stated, is that water, 60% of our water is a cross-boundary issue, transboundary issues that needs also management. It needs also action between them. The same thing when you talked about energy. Energy is also extremely important, but it depends also where the region stands on the energy consumption itself and where is the commitment. As you know, the Arab region, I can say that there is two groups of countries, if I can combine them. There's an oil exporting countries, and they have the fossil fuel exporting countries, and we have oil importing countries, and there's the energy story, is it? And this is where we start to talk about the transition. How do they transition? I mean, these different groups have different transition mechanisms to address the climate challenges. When we're talking about oil importing countries, there's a very much focus on the green transition, green technology transition, renewable energy, and they're adapting very much forward on the renewable energy. And where we see, for example, a lot of commitment on on the renewable energy, like we have a commitment to reach 50% on the renewable energy mix. Morocco has announced it. Egypt announced by 2035 to have 40% of the renewable energy mix. We do have another transition, which is the oil exporting countries transition. And here we're talking about different types. Yes, they have a commitment for introducing renewable energy in their mix for the energy consumption, but also there is another transition. It's the carbon circular economy transition of it. And then we might start talking about it at a later stage on it. But they do have also, despite the fact there is a commitment on the renewable mix. For example, we will see UAE, Algeria, Qatar are committing almost 20 to 30% of their energy mix to be in the coming 20 years to be renewable energy. In addition, there is a huge investment, irrespective if you are in a group 1 of oil exporting or in a group 2 where you are all importing on energy. There is a huge investments are coming up on the renewable energy in the region. And we just recorded a new world record of the lowest price of bid in the solar PV tender was in Saudi Arabia, which is almost like 1 cent for kilowatt hour for 600 megawatt PV plant project that was carried out recently in Saudi Arabia. We have also a huge power plant in the region, 400 megawatt power plant, which is the largest in the Middle East in Saudi Arabia, and it will be in a commercial in 2022 this year. And we see in renewable energies a huge renewable energies investments in Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, which there is a huge growth on the renewable energies. And because of these huge investments in the region, we are recording the lowest cost of solar power utilization and production in the region is happening globally. It's happening in the region as we go along. So there is that thinking that there's challenges. There is a unified thinking on how do we transition. Okay, the transitioning is very important. There is an understanding among countries of the transition, and where is the focus of that transition is important where it is, and the commitment on the transition is also adopted by all the Arab countries, which is that's very important issues for us as we go along.
Thank you, and I wonder if it's fair to summarize what I just heard, that in spite of the huge constraints, including some of the current geopolitical constraints, you see that there is actually decent progress being made toward the Paris goals in the Arab region. Is this a correct overall assessment of what I just heard?
Yes, Yanis, there is a progress, despite, if you will, unfortunately, despite you see our records is that we are still the renewable consumption is we are not meeting SDG 7. There is a lot to be done into it, but there is a lot of political commitment within the region as we go forward and we move forward on that thing.
Okay, well, thank you. So I'd like to just come back to something that you said from your own country, Kuwait, which is particularly prone to exceeding high temperatures. And if you look at the global level, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, particularly in its Working Group 1 report, which was published just last year, reaffirms that we're actually facing considerable challenges to achieve the deep emission cuts and the required carbon dioxide removal that the world needs to stay within the reach of the Paris temperature goal. That's the reality. It's going to be hard to achieve that. It even says, the IPCC report, that even in a scenario with net zero emissions around the mid-century and substantial use of carbon dioxide removal, it is still more likely than not that global warming would overshoot 1.5 degrees. That's at the global level. And even the lowest emission scenario that limits warming to 1.5 degrees at the end of the century estimates a temporary overshoot, somewhere in between. So I guess the question I would like to ask you, how do Arab states, which are already highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, plan to address the impacts of such a temperature overshoot, including your own country, which you mentioned very specifically? And also, what role can ESCWA and the Arab Center for Climate Change Policies play to support member states in addressing the risks of temperature overshoot?
Thank you, Yanis, on this. Yes, it is a big challenge. And it's, as we said, and you rightly said, is that it's a challenge on people, it's a challenge on food security, it's a challenge on our economies, or also as we move forward. And Arab states are recognizing these challenges now, and they started putting commitments on them. And we've been hearing commitment on net zero emissions. We have heard it from Saudi Arabia by 2065. We heard it from Kuwait. We heard it from Emirates, and other countries are committed for the net zero emission as we go along. But still, there is a lot to be done. And I said financing is a key issue. Okay, because this requires investments. And now I'm talking about a region that is highly indebted, that needs financing, and it cannot sustain that to address climate actions to have loans 10 times the grants. We need concessional loans. We need innovative climate financing, climate change financing to the region to support countries which are highly indebted, LDCs, and countries in conflict into it. As I said, oil exporting countries like Kuwait and others are starting to spend billions and billions of dollars, and Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and all the oil exporting countries to mitigate the impact of climate change by taking various policies and various projects to have a clean energy production, capturing, also engaging in the circular carbon economy itself to address part of the issues. At the same time, creating technologies and utilizing technologies to mitigate the impact of the carbon emissions, as well as creating industries for jobs. So the transition becomes as an economic diversification to these countries also to be independent. But if carbon is a transition stage of producing oil, it could be a transition but it will become a transition and a catalyst for economic diversification to their economy, while addressing the climate impact, while bringing the renewable energy mix to their decision making and their planning purposes as we move along. So that there is a balance of the commitment of climate mitigation and addressing climate challenges, but also a balance also on the development path for the countries and the prosperity of the people for a better quality of life, as it is important, and trying to mitigate. But also, it's, as I said, climate change is a global issue. So it's not enough that the regions who are producing oil, or the regions in the regions, we compared to the global emission, this region doesn't emit as much as the global emissions, but we are very much hard burdened, more than what we are emitting. Multiples of this. Yes. But this is where we say it's a community, it's a global commitment to mitigate, so that not only the Arab region, but other regions that we're seeing, and other countries that are least emitters, but highly hit into the impact of climate change. And there needs to be a good consensus, is that we need to develop countries needs to stick to their commitments and address the climate change. And as we're saying, there was a commitment of $100 billion on an annual basis for climate financing. And I think the developed countries need to fulfill this commitment, so that countries who are deeply indebted, countries that are highly impacted, can also mitigate the climate changes by having the finances needed as we go along. In ESCWA, we have the Arab Center for Climate Change Policies, which will support Arab states by providing them increasing access to climate data and analysis through our digital platforms and online tools. We have a RICAR initiative, which provide open access to regional climate projections and geospatial data sets that have informed impact and vulnerability assessments at the regional, country, and basin levels. Also, we created also at ESCWA a social expenditure monitor. It's an online tool for budgetary and fiscal reform purposes. So it tracks and allocates resources for climate action for member countries. And we try to support also in adopting disruptive technologies such as AI and remote sensing to help foster dialogues among countries, create much better knowledge. And as I said, water is a key issue of this. We and the World Bank are engaging in a collaboration effort for bringing Arab states on groundwater for the Mashriq region, on groundwater to support water security under a changing climate action. We and the world for the Mashriq countries as we go along. In addition, for financing issue as a challenge, we at ESCWA started at the end of December 2020 an initiative regarding climate SDG debt swap donor nexus initiative. And this is to help create fiscal space for climate action in countries that face liquidity constraints and suffer high debt burdens into it. And to provide transformative, that initiative of financing to provide a transformative change in countries to direct resources towards green recovery and providing creditors an opportunity to make true climate and finance commitments to developing countries. So we're bringing the developed countries with the developing countries who are highly indebted and have liquidity constraints to move forward on meeting the commitment on finance, mitigating climate finance and addressing it. And finally, we just finished. We're partnering with the League of Arab States and UNFCCC to develop need-based climate finance strategy that can help funnel financial resources to the region through improved targeting, training, and technical assistance. Into it. And we just finished also doing this strategy for the Arab countries, which is going to be adopted by the end of April with the Arab leagues.
Thank you. And you keep coming back to this very important issue of financing, and very rightly so. One possible way to increase access to finance is partnership with the private sector. So I was just wondering if there are some interesting examples in the Arab region of governments working with the private sector together in public-private partnership to actually achieve some of these goals.
Yes, there is a lot of bankable public partnership project with the private sector because it's very key. It's the solution to climate change is not only burdened on the government. It's a multi-stakeholders approach for it's the NGOs, the citizens, the private sectors, as well as the governments that need to address this. And there is a lot of projects we're seeing and pushing of it in terms of renewable energy projects that the private sectors, we see them in Egypt, doing a lot of financing on renewable energies. We're seeing it on water issues, also projects also in Jordan a lot. You see it in Morocco. We see IPPs projects in UAE and in Saudi Arabia, as well as in Kuwait on private sectors on water treatments. And so you'll see different private sector contribution in issues of renewable energy investments and in adaptation projects in terms of water projects and in different areas. But we need to increase this. But at the end of the day, is the private sector investments, they're looking for returns on their investments. So we're working also with member states and now with our debt swap to build a bankable projects for private sectors to be engaged in these projects and financing to flow on these types of projects.
Thank you. And I understood that last month in March, the first ever Middle East and North Africa Climate Week took place. And I was wondering whether there was much discussion there about carbon dioxide removal as a possible part of the climate response options that are being considered.
Yes, Yes, this was very. We were coming from Dubai on that week, on the climate week, and the discussion also and pushing the commitment on the carbon management technologies, to carbon capture, use, and storage of the carbon. That was been discussing into it. Innovative financing was discussed also into it as we move along, and pushing countries to adopt energy transitions and walking through with them what is the best appropriate energy transition mechanism and strategy that countries needs to be adopted. As we see, it's not one strategy fits all. It depends on the country. It depends on the economic structure of the country. It depends on its financing scheme for the country, and it depends also on the impacts on where the climate change is impacting the country and the commitments of the countries as we move along. There were a lot of discussions on this on the climate week, from technical issues to financing issues, to strategic planning, to collaboration. As we started the discussion at the beginning of it, it's a unifying element in the climate change, bringing policies, unified policies in the region, and to put them on the table. Issues of negotiation on the table for COP27 as we move along to COP27, which is going to be in Cairo, and 28. Where do we position the Arab regions? Where is the issues that needs to be addressed also at the global level during the COP27? So we have a common agenda. So yes, climate change, we go back to the first question, Yanis, you said, it's a unifying factor, but also it's a factor, it's an issue that is moving countries in a better diversification, better economic opportunities in a sustainable manner, so that we have a prosperity, but sustainable prosperity for our people in the region.
Yeah. Thank you. And in these discussions at the Climate Week and also elsewhere in the region, have you heard any discussions about this emerging technique that is quite controversial and for some quite challenging, the solar radiation modification, or also known as solar geoengineering, the technique that could perhaps stabilize global temperatures and avoid this kind of temperature overshoot while the world is decarbonizing and removing carbon from the atmosphere? So the question is there any discussion about this that you're aware of in the region?
As you said, there is uncertainty surrounding the solar radiation modification in the Arab region. And this is echoed there also, as it's echoed globally. And the potential for its deployment and the deployment of these new technologies is at its inception, because of the technology in maturity, the limited physical understanding about their effectiveness to limit global warming. So we are at the inception stage of looking in the region for these types of technologies as we go along. It's not being implemented, but there's a lot of discussion of it, and the viability of it, and the feasibility of it. And as I go back, Janice, the issue of resources. At the end of the day, you have a limited financial resources. You need to adopt the technologies that gives you optimize on the effectiveness and the maximum output of the resources that you need. So you need efficiency and effectiveness because of your limited resources. Have it been the region has unlimited financial resources, for sure these types of technologies would have been tried and implemented. With the limited financial resources, we need to optimize on their implementation to make sure it's effective and efficient as we go into the output, which we are trying to address and mitigate climate challenges.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to a particular issue that arises when one is considering carbon dioxide removal or carbon capture and storage, although that also applies to solar radiation modification. It's the so-called moral hazard. The concept is that, and this concept has a long history in economics, but I'd be very interested to hear your insight as an economist as to how to overcome that problem in a region where development currently depends on the production of fossil fuels. And the issue is basically very simple, is there is fear that if one talks about, let alone deploy these techniques, there will be a pressure, there will be less pressure to do what we really have to do, which is to reduce our emissions as a priority. So any thoughts on that from your experience as an economist, but also from the context in the Arab states how one can accelerate emission cuts and remove residual emissions in a way to reach the Paris goals?
There's some skepticism into it, is that because in certain Arab countries, especially the oil producing countries, we're talking about the dependency on oil for income and their livelihood and their economic stability and development into it. To what extent they see that movement will detract from getting the income for sustainability, and I think and economic development, because it's the sources of income, and to what extent this will trigger a trade-off into it. I think that the region is understanding that producing of oil, at the end of the day, oil is a limited resources, a limited natural resources. At one time, during certain stages, different countries have a different lifelines of their reserves on oil, but it will end up. So the countries are trying, to diversify, are trying to see substitutes to their oil for their economic diversification, and to ensure to mitigate also the impact, realizing that also the emissions that is coming up from the producing of oil is not is acceptable, and they have a moral obligation and responsibility at the global level to reduce the emission. Now, what is the path to do this? As I said, it's a balanced thing. So there is a commitment, there is an understanding, and the oil production is used as a catalyst for transformation. It's not is set to be the means for livelihood. It is a catalyst for transformation and economic transformation and prosperity. So countries in the region, and especially the oil producing countries, are realizing that we need to transform, and we need that catalyst, because this catalyst is the financing catalyst, where other Arab regions have limited financing resources to do and mitigate the impact of climate change. And we're asking for resources and financial resources to move in our energy transitions for oil and middle income countries in our region. So financing is coming from the production of this oil. So this is the catalyst to move into the energy transition in a proper, appropriate manner for the oil producing country. But it's gonna take time. But is there the political will? Yes, there is a political will into the process. And this is the most important, the political will and the determination and the acknowledgement of the global responsibility that these countries in that region have to the global community, and moving to it. But they have to move it also to make sure that the population that they are serving also live in a developed and a sustainable manner and in a prosperous manner. You cannot transition and say, okay, here it is, we close, we're not producing oil. And now we're seeing what's happening in the impact of the energy security itself is so much important to the global level. And we're seeing it now with the war in Ukraine into it. And we're seeing the increases in price because of the availability of energy availability. And now the consumer globally is impacted on its livelihood because of due to the inflation increase of it, and everybody is being impacted. So we need also to make sure that we have rationality in the adoption of whatever technologies and in the adoption of the transition itself, because it's not bounded by certain countries, but the impact and the energy security. And this is where we need to look into the global energy security as we move in the transition, so that we need to make sure countries are transitioning, but also securing energy security so that the global population and individuals at the global level doesn't get impacted so highly in the absence of the energy security availability.
It's fascinating what you said about the concept of oil production and the finance that it generates being the catalyst for transformation and the change. So I guess a follow-up question I would ask is, do you see any particular governance challenges that arise to ensure that in fact it does result in that transformation? Do you see any interesting developments in that area?
Yes, because there is a governance starting from the development plans of the countries. And the governance also is that transition, economic transition, is also depending on the employment generation. It's the non-oil economy, as we say, revenues. So there is different KPIs for governments. There is different commitments for governments as they go along on transitioning in an appropriate manner. So the development plans is number one. The commitment to the SDGs is number two in terms of addressing the SDG number 7, in terms of addressing climate change, 13, and addressing water issues, but also the SDG in terms of SDG 8 and on the industrialization and I'll go into the SDG 5 for women, because women are vulnerable groups that will be impacted, as well as the youth, as you go into the transition, because climate change is impacting these vulnerable groups, the women, the youth, into it, as they are living in agricultural lands which are being degraded in terms of becoming arable into it. There is governance. The other thing is that the global community indicators and monitoring is another governance element into it. And the SDG has been approved by all the countries in the world as a transition and a sustainable development. These are goals to implement the Agenda 2030. So there is a governance body, the SDG, practically you can take it as a governance body to make sure and ensure that these transitions are going on, in addition to the national governance elements from their development plans and the indicators as they move along.
Okay, well, there are challenges. There are big challenges that we're facing. There are some solutions, as we have heard. I'm just wondering, when you look at the enormity of the challenges that we're facing in the world and in the region that you work in, how does the world maintain hope while not shying away from describing the gravity of the situation? Is there better ways to communicate these challenges? Is the concept of planetary emergency useful? Is the management of risks of temperature overshoot useful? Is regional security lens useful? What are the ways in which we can do this better?
I think the hope is coming first from the youth. From our youth generation for their future. The care itself, they're driving the thinking, they're driving the production, they're driving the consumption. We're putting elements, the thinking, the policies, but they are the ones who are driving, and you see it at the global level. You go to youth in a least developed countries, or a youth in the developing countries, they care about the planet, they care about the climate issues. They are willing in different mechanisms to push the agenda and implement it. So you see that in their consumption, you see it enforcing the production, and the way the production has means and the elements that is being generated for the consumption. So they're pushing the private sector in their production element. They're pushing governments in their policies. They're pushing themselves in the way they're consuming and how do they consume things. So the hope, when you see it, this is a hope. We're giving them the elements to ensure that this hope, implementation of their hope and their sincerity and their commitment is there. So I see all the elements you just mentioned are as important, but it goes down to the individual level in a rural area, in a villages, in different countries of the world, that pushes this. And this is where I'm getting the hope from, because you see it in the eyes, you see it in their commitment, you see it in their dialogue among themselves, and technology have helped. Technology has helped a lot because it brought communication among these youth from the global togetherness. And this is very important. Sharing experiences through the internet, through their social media, it's bringing and driving the hope forward and implementing that hope. And that's why I'm hopeful that the commitment, it will be speeded up much more with the commitment of our youth.
Well, thank you for this very hopeful and positive assessment of how the youth are going to drive this change. And with that, Rola Dashti, thank you very much for participating in this episode of C2G Talk.
Thank you for having me, Yanis. Thank you very much.